Courtney, let's start with you. Just a couple of things that kind of stood out from my vantage point. He said that they're in a better place than they were in terms of these hostage negotiations. He did condemn the deadly attack of these U.S. troops, and he seemed to express a degree of optimism in terms of the eventual release of these hostages and a potential ceasefire. Did you, in general, feel like there was an encouraging direction, at least, that it seems, from the Prime Minister's perspective?
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Ryan, on a couple of things that stood out. On the hostages, he said, look, it's up to Hamas. At the end of the day, we're still waiting to see what Hamas says, if they agree to some sort of a deal to release these hostages, whatever that's going to look like. But he did point out that Qatar is continuing to try to be a bridge between these competing and these warring factions, and that they hope that they can continue to play that role. So he seemed to express some optimism on that. But again, it's still up to Hamas whether this actually is agreed to. He did condemn the attack against the Americans at Tower 22, and I thought it was interesting. He said that they are in constant or continuous conversation with Iran about these attacks by these Iranian-backed proxy groups, and that the message is they would like Iran to de-escalate the situation and not let this situation get out of control. But notably, David Ignatius tried to jump in and get a little bit more detail about what those conversations look like, and the Prime Minister did not really bite on that question. But again, Ryan, he did say that they are talking to Iran and trying to get them to de-escalate this situation.
So, General Twitty, let's talk, though, about the impact that these strikes and the loss of life by American servicemen from hostile fire could have in terms of the further escalation in the region. This is a red line that the administration probably didn't want to deal with. At what point will the U.S. respond, and what type of response is necessary in a situation like this?
Well, first of all, let me just say, obviously, that our U.S. deterrence posture in the Middle East is not working at this point. Here to date, we've had over 150 attacks on U.S. forces and our interests in Iraq. We've also had the Houthis down south in Yemen that have attacked commercial assets and our U.S. troops that are trying to secure those commercial assets. So we're in a precarious situation at this point. Of course, we do not want this war to expand. However, we must put in place deterrence, and we must hold Iran accountable for their actions. We have to stop playing whack-a-mole and hitting the proxies and go after the source, the instigator in all this, and this is Iran. And I would say we have to be careful in our actions here when we strike back. Iran in the Persian Gulf, perhaps ships, or Iran that are stationed in Syria. They have several units in Syria. I would be careful not to strike directly in Iran, because we do not want to broaden this war from any further than what it is today.
So, Jeremy, I want to bring you in to the conversation now. In particular, your thoughts of what the Qatari Prime Minister had to say about the hostage situation, because it's important to point out that there are still American hostages that are among those being held captive. And that means that the United States still has a very vested role. I mean, they would have under any circumstances, but it's even more urgent given the fact that there are still Americans being held hostage.
We have 6 Americans still being held hostage by the terrorists in Gaza. That means that it's the Biden administration's principal focus to make sure that the Americans come out. There are more than 130 other Israelis being held. There are other people from other countries being held. There is no way that Israel is going to be able to ultimately achieve all of its military objectives with those hostages still there. The hostages, in effect, are human shields that are being held by the terrorists. So we've got to get the hostages home. I would also add that Iran wants this war to expand. To General Twitty's point, Ryan, Iran has been funding Hamas, Iran has been funding Hezbollah, Iran has been funding the Houthis, and they're funding these Shia militia groups that are attacking American troops. And you have to go back to the height of the Iraq War, when Iran was funding Shia militias, firing explosively formed projectiles, high-powered IEDs at American service members, killing American service members on the ground in Iraq. To see this level of a killing by a nation state against American troops. I'll also add one other historical footnote. You have to go back to the Korean War to find an example of enemy aircraft killing U.S. ground troops. And that's exactly what happened over the weekend.
Yeah, it just shows how important this red line is that has been established and how the administration will respond. Matt Bradley, let's go to you. You know, the Qatari prime minister who just spoke with Andrea about the negotiations to get the hostages out and relief aid in, he said there was good progress. What are you hearing from Israeli officials and specifically Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu about these negotiations?
Well, Ryan, you know, we don't really hear much from the Israelis when it comes to these sort of negotiations. We didn't back in November, and we haven't been now. Most of the information we get is from the Americans, from the Qataris, sometimes from Hamas themselves. But I spoke with the Prime Minister's office today, and they said that, look, this hasn't necessarily been approved yet by Israel. This still has to go to the War Cabinet, and they're going to be meeting within the hour tonight. That meeting could last until well into the night, and then it goes to the full cabinet, where just about anybody, it sounds like, could torpedo this deal from the Israeli side. So there is still some deliberation to be done within the halls of power here in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem. There's a lot of discussion that's still to be done. But even with that, you know, we had an Israeli representative, the head of Israeli intelligence in Paris, speaking with Bill Burns and other representatives from Egypt, the Prime Minister of Qatar, who was just speaking with Andrea now. You know, they were there. They had a place at the table. So the real obstacle still is going to be Hamas. Now, we understand that Hamas said that they are flexible now, but their original position has not necessarily officially waived. That was, they aren't going to be releasing any hostages until they get a full and final ceasefire from the Israelis. And that's something that the Israelis have ruled out entirely. And whether or not this deal moves forward is going to depend largely on Hamas and whether or not they budge. They're the ones who hold the cards here. Guys.
So, Richard, one of the other interesting things that came out of that interview with Andrea is that the Qatari prime minister said that the only way forward is a two-state solution. We've obviously seen the prime minister in Israel kind of reject the notion of a two-state solution. Hamas has not necessarily been interested in that. How does that impact the greater conversation here in terms of the Middle East and the goal of peace? Is a two-state solution something that is even realistically on the table?
It's not realistically on the table at the moment. This Israeli government opposes a two-state solution. Hamas opposes the existence of the state of Israel. But it's got to be the prospect of a political process has to be ultimately on the table. That'll require an election in Israel. And in order to get the right outcome, I would say it'll probably require the president of the United States becoming a de facto participant in the debate about that election to make the case for it. Obviously, there'll be Israelis outside this government who will make the case for some type of satisfaction of Palestinian political ambitions. And then on the Palestinian side, we don't have a partner. Israel doesn't have a partner. So part of the process has to be to build a political alternative to Hamas. And the current Palestinian Authority is not poised to be that. But that's a process. Sometimes in negotiations, you have to think about it in phases. We need a pre-negotiation now. What we need to do over the next few years is create the pieces, the prerequisites of a successful political process. That ought to be our goal. Presumably, at the end of that, there could be something like a two-state solution under certain conditions, but we can't go from here to there. Too much has happened across the political spectrum, so we can't try to accelerate this too much.
And is that frustrating, Jeremy, given how much progress the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia in particular had made in terms of normalizing their relations? Obviously, October 7th changed all of that.
It's a fabulous point, Ryan, because if you think about why has Iran unleashed all of this violence through its surrogates and proxies on America, on our allies, on our interests, on our troops, it's because Israel and Saudi Arabia were on the cusp of making peace. And that grand peace would have transformed the Middle East. And part of that deal was going to be the United States providing security guarantees to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And that was an anathema to Iran. And so Iran has been unleashing a massive amount of violence. They've been engaged effectively in a proxy war against us and our allies. You know, Hamas killed 50 Americans. They took 14 American hostages. They continue to hold 6 hostages. Iran's surrogates and proxies have now unleashed 160 attacks against American troops. They've launched attacks against shipping, where the United States and our commercial partners around the world are suffering. So this is an Iranian strategy to disrupt this peace effort by Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. And I would just say, I think the Biden administration down the street is probably considering significant upgrade of our military activity in the region to include strikes against Iranian targets directly. That has to be on the table at this hour.
And then, Richard, finally, and it was touched on in the interview with Andrea and David and the Prime Minister, is these new details about UN aid workers accused of aiding the October 7th Hamas attacks. The U.S. has suspended its funding to this UN agency. I mean, how could this complicate getting that critical humanitarian aid into Gaza?
Well, it will complicate it. It also further undermines the UN's role and reputation for anything constructive. I think what we're ultimately going to have to do is find private sector groups, NGOs, if you will, that to take a much larger role, because it'll be a while before the UN will be an acceptable partner, to say the least, for Israelis. It's going to complicate an already complicated situation. Let's be honest.
Okay, Courtney Kube, Matt Bradley, Richard Haass, Lieutenant General Steph Twitty, and Jeremy Bash, thank you all for that great conversation. We appreciate it.